Thank you very much. This is wonderful. It's a great honor for Durham Law School to be working with NUS and others on this workshop for the UNFCCC Stocktake, which is one of the key areas that our research has been focusing on under the leadership of Professor Minerup in the Center for Sustainable Law and Development, Sustainable Development Law and Policy at the university. I think the workshop has experts around the table, and I'm not pretending to be one of them. But I think the key thing is to see this as an example of international law developing mechanisms to actually achieve objectives that the community has set itself. I think it's key that the entire system of the UNFCCC is based on both the bottom-up approach of the NDCs and the top-down of collective responsibility. And I think that is a fact that collective responsibility towards the common objective is operationalized through this global stocktake mechanism, which is innovative. There's many international law questions that I enjoy looking at, and I'm sure you are looking at as well, but this is not the time to go into that detail. I think this is now the time to start this fantastic workshop, and I'm really grateful for all the experts that have been assembled for this. And with these words, I would like to hand back to Petra, please.
Thank you very much, Volker, and yeah, good morning to Germany, where you are. Thank you for coming in briefly before boarding. I will actually now very briefly introduce the moderator of this session, who can then guide us through a slightly changed order to make sure everyone could speak here. So I'm absolutely delighted to have my colleague, Professor Russell, with us this morning, who is also a member of the Durham Centre for Sustainable Development Law and Policy, and an anthropologist. So as you know, Nilof and I and Danielle as well, we have run interdisciplinary events before, and we are very keen to bring scientists into the discussion, not just lawyers, but if it is lawyers, then also lawyers from practice and academia. And now we've got somebody who's researching in anthropology. So I'm really delighted to hand over to you now to run us through the session. And thank you again very much, Andrew.
Great. Well, thank you, and welcome everybody. It's a delight for me to be here. I'm going to learn a lot from this morning because my actual background is in global health diplomacy. So moving into global environmental diplomacy is a new shift for me. And so I'll just be taking us through the morning. I've got a rough sort of running order here with times. If anybody sort of exceeds their allotted time, I do have a Tibetan singing bowl here, which I will ring and ask people to that's just an indication that it's time to wind up, please. We'll be taking a break about halfway through. And I'm also a bit of a stickler for acronyms, because being new to this whole field, I thought GST stood for Global Sales Tax and NUS stood for the National Union of Students. So Petra was able to correct me on all those aspects, but there'll be other things, I'm sure, which will pop up during the morning. And so for a newbie like myself, it would be very useful to be put right on what they all are. Danielle, did you want to say a few words at the beginning, or shall we just go straight into the presentations? Okay, that's perfect. So the next person who's going to be giving us a perspective on the two workshops is Nilufer Oral, and so the floor is yours, Nilufer. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew, and greetings to everyone from Singapore. And first of all, I'm delighted that we do have an anthropologist with us, and we're breaking the silos of just looking at it from our legal perspective. It's important, so I appreciate that very much. And I'm fully with you on the acronyms. There's so many acronyms, it's a new language. But anyway, greetings to everyone from Singapore. Really, like Volker, it really is a great pleasure for the Center for International Law of the National University of Singapore to be collaborating with our dear colleagues at Durham Law, and also the Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy with dear Petra. We have a collaboration that started a year or two ago. It's gone really well. working on climate change issue. And this is one more on this, and it's in the particular issue of the Global Stocktake that will take place next year at the Conference of the Parties for the Climate Change Regime, basically COP28 in 2023. And indeed, this Global Stocktake should mark an important threshold in the process towards achieving the temperature goal that is set out by Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. And we all know that, that is to achieve a decrease or reduce, basically limit the increase of global temperatures to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. But we know that really the goal at this point is 1.5 degrees. So while the Paris Agreement sets out somewhat of a flexible, state-driven process for mitigation of greenhouse gases through self-determined, nationally determined contributions, NDCs, another acronym, the Global Stocktake that is to take place every 5 years, starting with the first one in 2023, really is an attempt to bring some collective and cohesive framework to what is otherwise a very state-generated process. There, unlike the Kyoto Protocol, there aren't any set emission reduction targets. However, of course, importantly, the Global Stocktake is not only limited to mitigation, it's much broader and encompassing different components of the Paris Agreement, and particularly adaptation and finance. So it's a very complicated process. So I'm delighted that we have these wonderful speakers and experts who will shed light on this process and its different aspects. And I think really that is the important purpose of these workshops, is to help all of us understand this first ever event, which really is a critical threshold as the window of opportunity to reaching that 1.5 degrees centigrade is closing. So, and our work in these workshops is not intended to be abstract or in a vacuum, but closely linked to the Global Stocktake that will take place next year. We very much hope to be part of the pathway leading to it and contribute to it by providing a forum for expert input and exchanges. So I will stop here and just say I look forward to listening to the speakers in this roundtable discussion and continuing our wonderful collaboration with Durham University. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Nilufer. So I think now we'll move straight into almost our guest speaker, who's Wolters Tubua, who's the Programme Officer at the UN Climate Change Secretariat, and he's going to be talking to us about the technical assessment phase of the Global Stocktake. So over to you, Walter. Thank you.
Greetings again, everyone. Thank you very much, Andrew. Can you hear me okay? Very good. I'm going to give myself a challenge to see if I can go through my presentation without using a lot of acronyms, or at least saying them out loud. So thank you very much, for the great introduction to the Global Stocktake. I think let me first of all situate it. I will start by situating it within the Paris Agreement as a whole, so that we can see what role it is intended to do. And then I will walk you through some of the mechanics of how the process is designed, what it aims to achieve, and then some opportunities for other stakeholders to get involved, and probably conclude with some remarks of my own. This presentation is basically informed by Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, as well as the more recent modalities that were adopted in Glasgow. So 19 CMA 1, that's the decision. And yeah, I will try to drill into some of those details. But let me start by, first of all, situating the GST within the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, as you know, has this bottom-up and top-down approach, which is really that hybrid way of approaching the and very inclusive, which a shift from what we have seen in the UNFCCC world, because both developing and developed countries have are equally involved, with some degree of flexibility accorded to developing country parties. But the main element is that every party to the Paris Agreement has what we call the NDC on the table, which is a pledge, nationally determined contribution. So they're basically saying, this is how much money I'm willing to put on the table. This is how much I am willing to do in terms of mitigation. This is how much I'm going to do in terms of adaptation. And that is done every 5 years. So I'm looking at the top left-hand corner box at the moment. And once you have put, the reason why I'm saying this is because a pledge is just a plan. It's not what you have done. So you now say, this is what I intend to do. And then you move into the implementation arm of it. You have 2 years to implement and report. So you would see that the reporting is shorter. It's every 2 years. And that is meant to more closely monitor that you've given us a pledge for 5 years. You've put up a pledge that is going to be renewed 5 years down the road, but at least we want to see how well you are implementing that pledge. And that is reported through what we call the Enhanced Transparency Framework, and they produce reports that are called BTRs, so basically biannual transparency reports. After that is done, this information is then aggregated and then is fed into the Global Stocktake. So all parties' BTRs or biannual transparency reports are put together, removing names of parties, removing groups, just to make sure that the information is basically as neutral as possible, and that fits into the Global Stocktake. But there is another element to it that I wanted to highlight, is that there are multiple perspectives that are involved in the Global Stocktake process. It's not just what parties are reporting, it's also information from scientists, it's information from various non-party stakeholders, like indigenous people will be able to put in information, environmental NGOs and all the like, they are all invited to provide input. And the real reason is really to say that before parties draw conclusions, as Nilefu was saying, in the United Arab Emirates, they would have received multiple perspectives and balance across the board. And then they can draw real conclusions based on that. Businesses would have provided input as well. So you would see here in the documents design that I have underneath there, basically saying the Secretariat produces synthesis reports. The IPCC, which is the science arm of the international process on climate change, fits into the process. Parties themselves, again, provide inputs. Constituted bodies are really technical bodies within the UNFCCC process, helping with various areas of work like technology, adaptation, and so on and so forth. All of these will be able to provide input to the GST. They have already done so, by the way. And some characteristics or criteria of the type of information that is looked at. We're actually looking at information that is both forward-looking and backward-looking, and by that jargon in our process basically means that we're looking at information that is planning information, which means intended, as well as information that is reported, which means information that is saying what has already been done. And then the information has to remain at a collective, aggregated or synthesized level, and it has to be balanced across thematic areas of the Global Stocktake. And I will quickly tell you what the thematic areas are in the next few moments. So the main thing that came out of the Paris Agreement is really to say that the Global Stocktake's main purpose is to take stock of the implementation of the agreement itself, with a view to helping to track progress towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Nilefu mentioned some of the, sorry for the wrong pronunciation of your name, mentioned some of the goals. And the goal, one of which is the temperature goal. The well below 2 degrees and 1.5 is only one of them. There is a goal of peaking emissions. There is a goal of making finance flows more consistent with climate resilient as well as low emission development, which is really a goal saying that if you want to address climate change, we need to see that your investment is shifting towards more climate-friendly initiatives rather than putting it towards fossil fuels. And the idea is that the Global Stocktake at the end of the day will identify opportunities as well as barriers and challenges, but then also really telling parties, okay, we know that you have put forward these barriers, But these are also solutions and challenge and opportunities that we have also seen coming across. Maybe they could be replicated in your area or in your country to address some of the issues that you're dealing with. So these are really the main thematic areas of the Global Stocktake. You can see it's a very, very comprehensive process. And like the previous speaker mentioned, it is really a complex process because of this level. The scope is extremely very, very broad. And this is the first time that this is happening within the UNFCCC process in 27 years. So we have mitigation, which is really dealing with reducing emissions. We have adaptation, which is really focused on the impacts that are already occurring. We have finance flows, like I mentioned, making sure that money is going in the right, investments are happening in the right areas. And then we have response measures, which is really taking care of the impacts of mitigation actions and loss and damage. So these are some of the goals that I thought maybe sharing them with you. This is what the Global Stocktake is tracking progress towards and helping to increase ambition towards achieving these goals that we've listed here. The goal of temperature, as earlier mentioned, adaptation, finance flows, peaking of emissions. I won't go through all of them anymore. But this is really the mechanics of how the process is designed. It's a 2-year-long process, and what you see on this slide is the outcome of the Glasgow of the Katowice decision. And the idea really is that we tried our best to put together 38 paragraphs in a decision on this slide, and it turned out to be a Christmas tree. But the areas that I want to quickly draw your attention to include the ones that you see numbered 1, 2, and 3, which are basically the main components of the Global Stocktake. It's just to tell you how it's designed. So there is an information collection and preparation component. And the idea really is that you don't just go out and gather this information as you wish, but you have some specific questions that have been put up front that the information is aiming to respond to. And then you have the technical assessment component. And the technical assessment is element number 2 that you see that operates in 2 layers. The first of which is a technical dialogue, which holds over 3 meetings. The first one took place in June 2022. There is one coming up in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the next one will happen in June again next year. And accompanying the dialogues are also what we call the joint contact group. So at the same time, you have the SUBSTA and the SBI, the subsidiary bodies in that process, also meeting. And the main reason why the SUBSTA and the SBI are meeting is to reflect on what is being done under the technical dialogue and provide any guidance. It's to say that, okay, we saw that the first meeting of the technical dialogue focused heavily on adaptation. Can you, during the second meeting, make sure that there is balance and focus in these areas which are also equally important for the Global Stocktake? So once all of these dialogues have taken place, there will be a synthesis report that will be prepared, and this synthesis report will tease out key messages that the technical people have found out. And all of these now will be presented to the politicians. So the high-level engagement in the UNFCCC process. And the implications of these findings will be discussed at that level, and then there will be a conversation as to what decisions could be made to ensure that the next round of NDCs that will be put forward in 2025 will be better than the ones that will be more ambitious to help us get to the goals that we intend to achieve. So we will have the Global Stocktake concluding in 2023, and there will be 2 years to really allow parties to make use of the information that will come out of the GST. Like I mentioned earlier, there are guiding questions for each of the components. The process itself is very open, inclusive, transparent, and facilitative. We have parties sitting next to non-party stakeholders and having a very open discussion. We have multiple processes under the UNFCCC that are working in along the same lines. We have what we call the Global Goal and Adaptation. We have the mitigation work program, and we have another program that is actually aimed at defining a new goal for finance. All of these are related to the Global Stocktake, but the Global Stocktake is really mandated to make sure that there is avoidance of duplication in all these areas. The process remains in the hands of parties, but there is also a heavy involvement of non-party stakeholders like businesses and others. And there is being a very novel process. The idea was that after the first one, there will be reflections next year in 2024, to really say that we're looking back to see if we can correct any things that were not well done in the first, during the, any elements of the modalities that could be refined will be done in 2024. So like I mentioned, the first technical dialogue took place in June, and it was really a learning by doing process, and it included all experts, non-party stakeholders, and it used multiple formats. Some of you probably attended the roundtables as well as the interactive World Cafe format, which was very welcomed by parties. And it already started by identifying some of the good practices, even though it was intended on really looking at how far away are we from the goals of the Paris Agreement. But parties and non-party stakeholders also put forward some of the good practices and opportunities and lessons learned. Then a summary report has been prepared. We published that on the 28th under the authority of the co-facilitators of the technical dialogue. One from a developing world, the other one from the north. They're the ones really steering the process, and they held informal consultations yesterday on the summary report, and received very, very useful feedback that they will take into consideration when preparing the next ones. Like I mentioned, there was also the joint contact group meeting in June, and they provided feedback to the co-facilitators. They actually encouraged these kinds of workshops. They said hold regional workshops, regional events, and hold any level of events on the Global Stocktake process, and make sure that the process is well understood by people before they come to the discussions. And also, if you feel like it, you can submit a summary of your report to the process. The next dialogue will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh, like I mentioned, and it's really shifting from defining how the gap between where we are now and where the goals are. They will now look at how can we fill these gaps, how can we bridge them. So it will be more solutions oriented when we get to Sharm el-Sheikh. And in Sharm el-Sheikh, this is what is scheduled. I put a slide here just looking at what is coming up, because in case some of you feel like engaging, like I said, there's submissions that were due in August, but you can still submit now. The summary report has been prepared. There's an information note, and the information note is really aiming at laying out what the plan for TD 1.2 is. TD 1.2 is a second technical dialogue that will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh. And then during the first week of the COP, we will have another set of roundtables. We'll have a World Cafe, we'll have poster sessions and a creative space. And like I mentioned, all of these, the main objective of that technical dialogue meeting is really to focus on how to bridge gaps and catch up with the goals of the Paris Agreement. In parallel, the joint contact group will also meet, and we already know that they always provide guidance to the co-facilitators in designing their next meeting. But then the question is, what else will the joint contact group do? Because if you look at it now, you would see that we're not too far off from when the Global Stocktake actually concludes its work in the United Arab Emirates. So maybe the joint contact group may feel like making a pronouncement on a little bit of more focus on the elements of what that outcome could be, or that output could be. And then there is the overarching decision of the CMA, which also could already take note of the progress that has been made under the Global Stocktake, and also if parties feel like it, they could make a pronouncement on what else, on maybe mandate some people to do some more work to put the process on track, if at all we don't feel that way. So we are receiving submissions. Up to now, we have 61 of them. One from groups of parties, we have 2 from individual parties, and we have 58. You can see what I was mentioning, that is really a very inclusive process. So you see a variety of submitters on the table. How stakeholders can get involved. If you feel like getting involved, we're encouraging actors out there to get together, jointly make submissions. That way, the submissions are more manageable in terms of number, and they are more complementary rather than duplicative and repetitive. So that submission could be prepared by just any institution that feels that they are in a position to speak on any of the thematic areas that I listed earlier. You could also organize events like this one, and we're happy to support such events. And you can also, in developing world, support your national governments to better understand what the Global Stocktake is all about, understand the material that is coming out. Like now the summary report is out, maybe some workshops to really explain the key messages coming out of the summary report. And you can plan also to participate in the meetings of the technical dialogue, which are ongoing. Like I mentioned, there will be one in Sharm el-Sheikh, the next one in June. I will stop here, and I didn't hear your bell ring, so I guess I have a few minutes that I can take a few questions. So please, I know that approaching you with my presentation, I was conscious of the fact that I was not going to probably go into the areas that are of interest to all of you. So I'm really open to taking any questions that you may have to clarify any areas that I may have missed. Thank you.
Thanks, Walters. Walters, can you stay with us for the duration today, or do you need to leave?
I will try to be, yes, I will try to be available, yes.
Okay, so we might just keep the questions for a little bit later, if that's all right, just because I realized we didn't actually have Danielle to tell us about the context and also to summarize the last workshop that we had, which I think would also be quite helpful as the kind of preamble and setting the scene too. So if that's okay, unless anybody has a burning question for Walters about his presentation, I think we'll go back to Danielle and get some context from her.
No problem. Thanks very much, Andrew, for giving the floor on this. So thanks very much for firstly, like Nilufer, it's a delight to be here, and it's a wonderful to be partnering with Durham University's Petra and her team on this really excellent initiatives and series, and really just to set a little bit of a context as to what where this workshop sits in the scheme of things. And the idea here really was to have this is actually going to be the second of a two-part workshop series, and it's an initiative really intended for us to deep dive into the issues relating to the global stocktake, and actually to be able to, from this series of workshops, and including what we have in mind, to conferences that will build on these two workshops and to build on the discussions that will take place at COP and going forward, to produce outputs and outcomes, whether they're guidance, whether they're information sheets, whether they're policy papers, that will serve as very useful, practical policy legal guidance for governments who are delving into this process. And so this was really the larger context in which we sit. And coming back to Walter's comment earlier, certainly it is every intention to really work together collaboratively with partners like Durham to really produce submissions that will be helpful to advance this process. So that really is the context. And coming back to the first workshop, I'm delighted to say that we had the first series of the workshops just this week on Tuesday. And the focus there was on climate, oceans, and oceans in the context of global stocktake. And we had a wonderful panel of speakers, including collaborators from the UNFCCC, Joanna. Those I'm very delighted and grateful for her as well. And we had a wonderful discussion on, really among other things, the role of oceans. And as Nilufer had asked, where is the oceans in the UNFCCC process? And the response, of course, was provided by Joanna, amongst other speakers. And so it was a wonderful to and fro of conversation in that. But what came up quite clearly also is the recognition of this process. There's a recognition of the role of the oceans in the UNFCCC. There may be differences in views as to how quickly or how slowly the process is going. Or is it sufficient? Is it enough? And how much more can be done? And I think the overall consensus was much more can be done, although there may be a difference of views in how that is to be done, perhaps. Another recognition that came out from the discussion was really the need for coordination and interaction between the climate scientists in particular, and the lawyers and the policy. And that came up very strongly in the discussion that perhaps there is not enough of that taking place at the ground level. And so that was in a nutshell, like the discussions we had and where we want to see this series going forward. And so again, it's I'm very delighted to be here, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share this platform with all the speakers here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Danielle. That's really helpful to have it sort of put into context. Also, the last workshop, which is really sounds like it was a very fruitful and important one. We're now going to go on to Imogen Stevens. Imogen is the policy officer at the Carbon Disclosure Project in London, and she's going to be talking about the process of the GST. So over to you, Imogen.
Excellent, thank you. I'll just, there we go. Right, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I'm really excited to gain a bit more insight from an academic perspective here today as well. So my name is Imogen Stevens. I'm a policy officer at CDP. And yeah, I'll be bringing a little bit more of an NGO perspective to this discussion today, and look into non-state actors and how they're participating in the global stocktake. So for those of you who don't know CDP, CDP is a global nonprofit, and we run the global disclosure system that enables companies, cities, states, and regions to measure and manage their environmental impacts. And through this, we've built a really comprehensive collection of self-reported environmental data that investors and purchasers and policymakers around the globe use to make better informed decisions on investments and policies. So to give you an idea of the type of data that we have, in 2021, we had over 13,000 companies that reported through us. And we have 3 questionnaires on climate change, on water security, and on forests. So not just focused on the climate aspect, but also wider environmental data too. And alongside these companies, we also had over 1,100 cities, states, and regions that disclose their environmental data through us. So now that you have a bit of an idea about the kind of data that CDP has, I can tell you a little bit about why we're engaging on the global stocktake. So we believe that the global stocktake should be purpose-driven. It should really contribute to enhancing ambition for parties and non-party stakeholders as well. And secondly, it should be inclusive. So inclusive both in terms of the types of actors involved, so involving parties and non-state actors, and inclusive as well in terms of all regions that are involved in this and where these actors are coming from. And thirdly, it should also be evidence-focused, and high-quality data should be front and center of this process. And also just a little bit of an overview of why we think non-state actors should be included as well. So firstly, this is really important for accuracy. The global stocktake assesses a collective progress towards Paris Agreement goals, how the world as a whole is moving towards these. And as evidenced by the thousands of actors reporting through CDP, there's a lot being done in this space that we'd like to see taken into account as part of this process. And secondly, for ambition and non-party stakeholder climate action can really help catalyze wider change as well and demonstrate support for more ambitious policies, which I will touch on as well a little bit later. So earlier this year, CDP released a policy brief on the global stocktake, in which we identified 2 pathways to take stock of non-party climate action. The first one was through direct submissions to the global stocktake. So following the approach of the first global stocktake, non-party stakeholders can provide submissions directly to this process through the UNFCCC. And also, through the nationally determined contribution process and biennial transparency reports, which are those reports that parties use to report on their greenhouse gas emissions, their NDC progress, adaptation actions, and support, etc., under the enhanced transparency framework. So noting that this will not be quite as applicable for the first global stocktake, these reports are first due by the end of 2024, so after the first stocktake has been completed. but nonetheless important to keep in mind for future stock takes, and also to really keep in mind all these linkages between the different aspects of the Paris Agreement. So to dive a little bit deeper into this first pathway to direct submissions to the Global Stocktake, as Walter's already showed in the presentation previously, there have been many submissions, mostly from academic institutions and from NGOs. And we'd also really like to see a bit more of a streamlined reporting process for the actors that we deal with, so companies, cities, states, and regions, to submit their data into this Global Stocktake process that makes use of existing initiatives that are already there. So one highlighted now on the slides is the Global Climate Action Portal, which is held by the UNFCCC, to which CDP is a key data provider along with other organizations too. And to make sure that this is taking place and we're adequately capturing all this, there is a need currently still for capacity building, for reporting on progress, to make sure that all these actors can report. And this is specifically the case for the Global South, where there are currently data gaps in non-state actors reporting, but is also the case for the Global North, to make sure that the highest emitters are included in this process and are choosing to participate. To highlight an example of this kind of capacity building that CDP is currently carrying out, we have a project taking place at the moment in Brazil on the Global Stocktake that is focusing on subnational governments and is engaging all of CDP's stakeholders to disclose and monitor their climate actions, both to enhance transparency, but also for accountability. And alongside this disclosure, the project is also aiming to communicate the Global Stocktake process to Brazilian stakeholders to ensure that they see the value of participating in this process, and to make sure there's a strong Brazilian voice coming through in the Global Stocktake too. So as part of this, CDP Latin America recently released an explainer on the Global Stocktake, how transparency can drive global climate action. And there's also several other webinars, workshops, and reports planned to really get this message across to actors in Brazil. And secondly, I'm diving a little bit deeper into the second pathway through nationally determined contributions and these biennial transparency reports. So we believe it's important to include non-state actor data in this process too, to really further enable a closer link to parties and greater information sharing between actors. And this is really vital because not only do government policies have the ability to promote more non-party action, but also the opposite is true too. So as non-party action has the ability to catalyze wider change by providing this evidence to governments that businesses and other actors are in support of ambitious climate policies. And the Global Stocktake is really a great opportunity to showcase all the action that's taking place, and to demonstrate that the world is ready for more ambition. And this also aligns with recommendations that are put forward by the COP26 presidency, that governments and capacity building providers should really encourage this whole of society participation in the transparency process. So this includes all subnational governments, private sector too, all of whom can contribute to enriching data on this, on climate action. And so as part of a program of work that CDP has with the Ministry of Ecological Transition in Italy, we developed a methodology that took stock of Italian non-party stakeholder contributions to achieving this 1.5 degree target of the Paris Agreement, and also of the EU NDC. So of the 194 Italian companies that were analyzed, 46% of emissions were aligned with 1.5 and 49% were aligned with the EU NDC. So we can see that there's still a little way to go for Italy's ambition, but this really gives a really useful overview at a national level of how non-state actors are contributing. And this is a globally applicable framework that we're looking to further develop as well, to include nature metrics in this, to include cities, states, and regions beyond just companies at the moment, and to also include the progress made as well as just the ambition that's in place. So thank you. That was an overview of what CDP is doing on the Global Stocktake. If you'd like any more information, you can find our policy brief online. We've also made several submissions to the Global Stocktake process, which can be found through the UNFCCC portal. And if you'd like any more information, please don't hesitate to get in touch. My email is there.
Great, thanks so much, Imogen. That's really helpful to get a better sense of the process and the different pathways to that. So with everyone's permission, we'll move straight on to Petra Minarov, who is going to be talking to us about considering the outputs in future NDC. So over to you, Petra. Petra, are you unmuted? I'm not getting your voice.
Is it better now? And you can see my slides. Okay, so I will start again. Thank you very much. I think it's wonderful to see how these different presentations already outline how the process is so very important to get this right with the first Global Stocktake, and also how non-party stakeholders, as Imogen just demonstrated, can be brought into this process. Now, in the light of what especially Nilufer said on Tuesday in our first workshop, to focus on the process that we have under the UNFCCC, which is quite unique in its kind, so we don't have these under UNCLOS or any other international environmental regimes, I would like to look into how legal is this process? Where can we find the law? So we were looking on Tuesday, can we find the oceans? Can we find more of the scientific evidence that can inform the information that has to be provided with the NDCs, for example? And now I would like to look into how legal is the process? Where can we find especially a legal link between the outputs and then the next round of ambition and rising ambition in particular? And I will do this in 3 steps. I will give you, so this is my driving question: how can the outputs enhance ambition? I will give a broad overview over mandate and process, and this has been already very well covered by Walter, so there is no need to go into much detail here. And then talk a little bit about the procedure rules. Now, as we know, on in Article 4.9, the Paris Agreement requires a mitigation that when parties communicate their NDCs every 5 years, they take the outcomes of the stocktake into account. And this requires a certain design of the Global Stocktake to make it comprehensive, to result in these outcomes that can then usefully inform the next submission of NDCs through aligning timeframes, but also substantially through aligning the outcomes and the know-how about where we are at in the next round of the NDCs. And I'm really interested in this consideration of outcomes and outputs process, and how can it be ensured that there is a legal level. Now, there are 3 phases of the Global Stocktake. There's the information collection process, there's the technical assessment phase in which we are at the moment, and then there will be the consideration of outputs and high-level events in the run-up and at COP28. Now, this consideration of outputs, as we learned from decision 19 CMA 1, is focusing on discussing the implications of the findings of the technical assessment with a view to achieving the outcome of the Global Stocktake of informing parties. So again, I really want to concentrate here on the terminology, on the phrase "with the view to achieving the outcome." So this is still a relatively wide phrasing of what these outcomes or how these outcomes should be considered. It's only with the view to achieving the outcome of the global stocktake of informing parties. So again, we don't have any clarity here yet how this process of informing parties in updating and enhancing their NDCs will be facilitated. Now, in this current technical assessment phase in which we are, the co-chairs deliver guiding questions, and these guiding questions will guide the discussion and facilitate the technical dialogues. And inputs are then invited from parties and non-party stakeholders, as we've heard, to the submission portal of the Global Stocktake. Now, TD 1.1 has focused on all three aspects: mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation, as will all the other technical dialogues, which will be 3 altogether. And so why are these procedural elements so important? And that again ties in with the CMA and the decision that these procedural and logistical elements of the overall global stocktake process will be refined based on the experience gained from the first, but also the subsequent global stocktakes as appropriate. So we will see a learning by doing, and this is something that drives the entire process. So yesterday there was a meeting organized by the co-chairs of the technical dialogue on the first summary report that Walters has already mentioned here. And they established also the timeline that is derived from the mandate that the CMA has given to this process. So we will have now, in line with Article 14, the first global stocktake finalized at COP28. This entire process started in 2021 and will conclude at CMA 5. And following the first round of inputs, which has just been or is in the process still of being completed, and the submissions, the technical assessment began then in June 2022. There will be another one now, another technical dialogue in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then the next one will be next year. Now, the working methods of this process are, again, very much facilitative. It seems to be, at least at this point in time, still at the conceptual level. So the work is focused on identifying opportunities for learning by doing, including for assessing collective progress. So it's of course in line with Article 14 not to focus on a singular party, not on focus what the single party has achieved, but what the collectivity of all parties are achieving. And then to identify on that basis the necessary steps for the consideration of inputs as they become available. So this is party-driven, should be conducted in a transparent manner and with the participation of non-party stakeholders. Now I come to the point where I really wanted to land, and this is the procedure rules about how these outcomes are then will be formulated, will be taken into account, and how can we have some form of accountability to see that parties have these outputs really taken into account, and on that basis we can see an increase in the ambition, because we know so much already about the outcomes of the IPPC. We know where we are at the moment. We know that in line with the summary reports that have already been published, that we are looking at an increase in global emissions of between 10 to 13% compared to 2010 in 2030. So it is not that we have a lack of knowledge of where we are at, or that we don't know that we are not yet there. So the main question we really need to focus here is on how do we make sure that this knowledge is really utilized for better action, so taking it from this more conceptual level to the concrete level of concrete recommendations. And I think that was something that was acknowledged yesterday as well in the discussion and the presentation around this summary report. Now, decision 19 CMA1 also decides that the outputs of the components of the global stocktake should summarize opportunities and challenges for enhancing action and support in the light of equity and the best available science, which we already have. The IPCC will also flow into this collection of material process. But again, this on its own, again, doesn't explain really how this information flow will enhance ambition. It is just about summarizing the opportunities and challenges. It, so to speak, stays with the thinking about the outcomes of the process and not really linking it to the next round of the indices, at least from my perspective at this point. And then also the decision emphasizes that the outputs of the global stocktake should focus on taking stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement to assess collective process. Again, a reiteration that there shouldn't be an individual party focus and to include only non-policy prescriptive consideration of collective progress. So at this point, I think from a legal perspective, it would be justifiable to at least ask the questions. And this is just about asking the questions and finding a way to discuss this really. Is this diminishing the expectation that maybe Article 14 sets forth of this cycle or the ambition ratcheting up mechanism that we all assume exists based on the essential and important role of the global stocktake in enhancing ambition? So I think it's justified to ask here whether there is maybe some form of stepping back from this idea that the global stocktake will be so essential in driving the ambition up. Now, the outputs of the component of the global stocktake, this is also further identified in the decision 19 CMA1, should identify opportunities. It should summarize the key political messages, and it should be referenced in a decision for consideration and adoption by the Conference of the Parties, so the CMA 5 then, and or a declaration. So I think this will be very crucial to observe and to get right, to have a decision that uses relatively clear language for the outputs and for the way in which they should be considered. And also adding this in form of a declaration would give extra emphasis to this entire process. Now, but it's still at this point, I think, unclear how legal this will be, or whether this will be more concentrating maybe on the political will, which again, in and of itself is not necessarily completely against the wording of Article 14, or it's not even fully undermining the idea of coming to a positive ambition rising exercise, but it is then clearly a political one and not one that is really a legally construed process. Now, the summary report that was published late in September and discussed yesterday also gives already some reflections of the co-chairs from the first technical dialogue. And they emphasized, among other things, on the emissions gap identified by the IPCC as the difference between projected global emissions with nationally determined contributions in 2030 and emissions in 2030 from mitigation pathways consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 or well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So this difference between the projected global emissions that would arise from the NDCs that we see today and those that we would need to see if we were going to keep in line with the temperature target. Whereas then the implementation gap refers to the gap between the NDC mitigation pledges and the expected outcome of existing policies, given that not all states yet have these long-term low emission development strategies in place. Now, both was highlighted. There is an emissions gap, but also an implementation gap. And one of the key reflection was that now discussions should be deepened, and this was agreed by some parties who made some statements there, to moving from the conceptual to the more concrete level. So I think this is a very promising move, and hopefully we will see something coming out of that. I come now to my final considerations on how we could design this as a more legally meaningful process, perhaps. So I think when parties are invited to present their nationally determined contributions, that should be informed by the outcome of the global stocktake under a special event held under the auspices of the Secretariat General of the United Nations. And when they do this, when they supply this next round of NDCs, they also need to provide the information to provide clarity, transparency, and understanding, which we know from the Katowice climate package. And so this information specifies or requires from parties to demonstrate how their preparation of their NDC has been informed by the outcomes of the global stocktake. And I think this is really crucial, and ideally should be somehow referenced in the decision that reflects on the outcomes and outputs of the global stocktake, to ensure that it becomes clearer what the parameters are, what are the key performance indicators, so to speak, so that the party can demonstrate that its preparation of the next round of NDCs has been actually informed by the outcomes of the global stocktake, to enhance some or bring in some aspects here of accountability. And also perhaps considering that fairness and ambitious is also something that the party has to demonstrate, to bring that also in with the process of the global stocktake, because so much is also considering fairness and ambition in existing NDCs. So how again can that be brought in to the demonstration of the party, how it now, in the light of the outcome of the global stocktake, considers that its NDC is fair and ambitious. And finally, how does the NDC, of course, contribute to the global objectives on climate change? So I think the outcomes of the global stocktake need to be tied into all three of these aspects to make it the most meaningful process. And this is now my final slide. So this is again from the summary of the first technical dialogue. And so far, global emissions have continued to grow over the past 3 decades in absolute units, as we all know from the IPCC reports. Though in relative terms, the rate of emissions growth has slowed if we bring that into relation with GDP growth, population growth. And most of the global carbon budget has been utilized, and in the absence of accelerated retirement, future emissions are locked in through existing and planned infrastructure. Consequently, the remaining carbon budget will be depleted soon. So I think strengthening of the legal links between outcomes, outputs, and NDC ambition is crucial, given that we need to see a process that is ideally underpinned by some accountability of parties. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks very much, Petra. So yeah, we've now got I think up to 15 minutes for discussion and questions for any of the speakers. So probably the best thing to do is either to raise your hand, or if you want to put a question in the chat box, please use that facility and we'll take things forward from there. Thank you. Stunned silence so far. Oh, Marcus, thank you. You have a question or a point you want to make.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a question for Walters, and I'm coming back in my own intervention to Petra's excellent presentation. I have to, I think, slightly remodel what I'm going to say after her excellent expose, which, yeah, already made so many important legal points. Walters, maybe I'm wrong, but I see a lot of interest from the NGO sector, from businesses, from the different stakeholder communities, indigenous people, youth. Where is the engagement of the member states? We're not seeing the same level of detailed discussions, interventions, submissions by the member states, by the parties. And I'm wondering whether the Secretariat has a strategy to sort of enhance also their participation, because when we get to 2023 and the process has been very open, lots of non-state actors have participated, but then the parties sort of water the global stocktake down, that would be a suboptimal outcome. So what's the Secretariat doing to sort of enhance qualitative party engagement?
Thank you. Andrew, can I? Yes, okay. Thanks a lot, Marcus, for the excellent question. I think you hit the nail on the head. That's a very, very important point you raised. I am, at this point, I don't think that we have gone against the modalities of the global stocktake just yet. It's unfolding at its should. And the reason why I'm saying that is because parties really designed this process to say, let's have a technical dialogue, a technical process, which is independent of their interference. They did not want to have the political influence on what is happening. That's why you would see that at the moment, the momentum is really at the technical level, holding these technical dialogue meetings, IPCC providing input, WMO, UNEP, GAP reports, all of these coming to the table so that they can have an honest and a non-politicized discussion. This will then lead to a factual synthesis report that will be produced. And the design of the GST then says, once these technical conversations have finished, they will then hand over these key messages to the political level. And that's where parties will now hold their own, what we call the high-level events in the consideration of output, which is the final component of the GST. So I think that it is happening by design, that they are staying silent. And at this moment, the only layer, the political layer that I see is the joint contact group, which is basically keeping an eye on how the discussions within the technical dialogue are unfolding and advising and telling the experts, as well as those interacting at the technical level, look, we think that these discussions are going too much in they're just giving overarching guidance. Like the last one, they said they like the inclusive nature of it. They encourage more regional kind of discussions to also take place, so that there is a regional perspective to the decision that will end up being adopted. I am not concerned at the moment that parties haven't been really heavily involved, because the design of the GST, even if you see it as flawed, it is happening as it was, the modalities have basically mandated. But there is growing interest now, because given how slow the GST process, the UNFCCC process has proven to be, there is growing appetite now to start engaging at the political level in preparation for United Arab Emirates. But they will still try to keep that at an independent level. You would see that there were some discussions, probably those that were involved at the pre-COP, the COP president, outgoing COP president, basically said he wanted to see an outcome on the GST at Sharm el-Sheikh. And yeah, and what we are also seeing is that there are attempts to hold some kind of high-level events. Even at UNGA, there was the General Assembly, there was an attempt to hold a high-level event on the global stocktake and all of that, but they are very conscious not to interfere with the technical discussion that is happening, which is supposed to be based on facts and science and all of that. I'll stop there. Happy to clarify any follow-up questions.
Thanks, Walters. There's two hands up, Nilufer and Petra. I'm not sure who put their hand up first, but maybe Nilufer, would you like to
Well, actually, Petra did. Petra
Okay.
can go ahead.
I would be happy to raise mine. It's just a very quick thank you actually to Walter. So Marcus, a very good question, one that also was in my mind, but thank you very much, Walter, for the clarification. I think that's extremely useful to hear. And I have to say, yesterday when I sat in this in the presentation of the summary report, I can only imagine how much work goes into this and how many inputs have been received, and colleagues in the UNFCCC seem to be reading all of these inputs as they are coming in. So there isn't even a formal cutoff date where you can't submit. So it's really an inclusive and comprehensive process. And I think that was reflected in the very balanced and extensive summary report that they presented. So I think it's really important to acknowledge this immense work that goes from the Secretariat into this process. And I think it's probably our task here to bring in these different views and to ask, how can we support the process? How can we ensure that it is not going into a direction that nobody really wanted, and it's maybe just driven by a political agenda or something, so that we can ask the right questions? And I think, so certainly my presentation was trying to bring this perspective in of where can we find some law. Is it wishful thinking? Should there be any? And being an open question, almost informed through your views, is really useful. So thank you again very much.
Great, thank you. So Nilufer, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just very briefly, and first of all, compliment Walters and Petra for really very excellent presentations. Walters, you kind of lifted some of the fog from my mind in trying to understand very complicated process. And I think I have a better understanding, but more to go, still more to study. And Petra, you really asked them. As always, your analysis was right on, and you asked good questions. And I think ultimately, whether this global stocktake will drive ambition, and where are we heading with it? And Marcus, exactly your question, but now I think Walter's answered that. And I guess it's like one issue. This was a discussion I was having the other day with a colleague visiting us here. At the end of the day, there's so many reports coming out of the process. How will this one make a difference? Or will it just be another, bunch of reports? But secondly, it's also clarifying what we can do. And Petra, you said it very nicely. What can we do to really drive the process in our limited way? But again, informing, but also I'm thinking of the region here, particularly the ASEAN region, whether you think there's an opportunity and need for us to really, not just academic, but really pushing states at the at least at the governmental level. I don't know how high we can go. So I'll just stop here.
Thank you. I've got a question for Imogen, if I may, just because I detected a certain kind of frustration at the beginning, Imogen, when you were talking about the need to streamline the process for the pathway 1, at least. And I just wondered if you had any sort of insights, further insights into that you'd be willing to share with us. And also, how do you go about sort of this question of scale? What is a legitimate kind of contribution from an NGO, and how is that kind of process managed? And you mentioned capacity building as well, which must be a really key driver for to get efficient and effective inputs.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we're at an interesting point, and I think coming out of the UN General Assembly and New York Climate Week, there was a little bit of this recognition where we have so many commitments from non-party stakeholders as well, but there's still this question of how we hold people to account, and what a commitment looks like, and how we track all the progress from for the non-party stakeholders have made. So I think this is still a bit of an open question about how to feed all that information in, and how we manage to track all of that. So I'm hoping, certainly GCAP has made a start. The Global Climate Action Portal has tracking progress indicators now on their site. So that's certainly one thing to use. But it's a high volume of information, and really streamlining that is hopefully a way to make sure that it's condensed, and having that kind of streamlined process means that all these different reporting initiatives can really be brought together in a way that's understandable, and is hopefully clear to parties as well.
Great, thanks very much. It's 10:15 our time, so I'm going to propose that we have a 5-minute break at this point, just for comfort and convenience and refreshment, and we'll resume in 5 minutes at 10:20. So can I just take this opportunity to thank all the contributors so far. I'm learning a lot, and I look forward to the rest of the contributions today. Thank you. And to keep ourselves on schedule, hopefully for a 11:30 our time completion. So our next speaker is Marcus Gehring. Marcus is from the Centre for International Governance Innovation at Hughes Hall in Cambridge. So look forward to your contribution, Marcus. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And it's a particular pleasure to share this webinar with such dear colleagues and experts. I wanted to come back to Petra's intervention, because I think what always struck me as particularly interesting and somewhat surprising is the mandatory language in Article 14, right? It doesn't say should, it doesn't say could, it uses mandatory language, it uses the word shall. So it means the global stocktake is not something that would be nice to have, and if we didn't, it didn't matter. It's an integral part. In a way, it's part of that global bargain, right? On the one hand, we let everyone determine their own nationally determined contribution, their own NDCs, but on the other hand, we have long-term objectives. We have several objectives, as Walter's pointed out, in the Paris Agreement. And we have a global stocktake to take stock of how we're doing with regards to those objectives. And I think taking into account the sort of mechanism of the Paris Agreement, the sort of act local and think global mantra that is embedded in Article 14 should not be left out of sight. I think Petra, said the text in the Paris rulebook say parties are invited to take the global stocktake into account in their new NDCs. I think in my interpretation of the Paris Agreement text, simply just the treaty text, that could also be, that invitation is one of those invitations that you really shouldn't turn down going forward. And the question I have, so looking at CMA 119, it is actually a very comprehensive implementation decision, right? It's the sort of Katowice rulebook that set the rules for the global stocktake, actually covers all areas and opens the possibility to all sectors of society to be involved. So I think where we need to increase our reach is very clearly with the private sector, with companies, with banks, with the financial sector. We do have reports on how these sectors are doing in terms of their own climate targets, in terms of their own climate reports. But the sort of area that I mostly cover, international trade, for example, seems to slip a little bit through the cracks, right? So what about the interaction? What about international shipping, aviation? You know, can we? It's not per se covered by the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement. But the Global Stocktake is so open-ended, also in the Katowice decision, that we could integrate some of those aspects and become more ambitious in that sense. And I think the discussion on Monday about the oceans, the ocean science, actually indicates to me that the Global Stocktake could be one of those entry points where matters not specifically covered by the Paris Agreement could have a place, could be started to discuss. And therefore, we would enhance the ambition of the Global Stocktake and then hope to inspire some of the parties to maybe include some of those aspects in their NDCs. I think the balance also between mitigation, adaptation, and finance needs to play a bigger role, right? The EU, Western countries love to talk about mitigation, maybe start talking about adaptation as well, but really don't like to stocktake the financial commitments, don't like to stocktake what about climate finance, what about the Paris Agreement commitments on the financial side. And I think there's an opportunity for the rest of the world, especially the area and the region of the world where our Singaporean colleagues are based, to maybe ask more questions about what is the Global Stocktake on the third leg of the Paris Agreement, which is finance. And you know, I'm seeing the sort of preliminary discussions, see a lot of submissions on the technicalities, on the science, but I'm still looking for, I think, more on the very important part, especially when I'm talking to my developing country colleagues about the financial package, about the financing part of the Global Stocktake, and that would be my second recommendation. So involve companies, but then also pay some attention to the financing part. I would love to know, for example, what the financing gap is, because so many countries in their NDCs use the second and the third column of the measures they would like to adopt if they had the necessary financing. Are we really capturing that kind of financing gap, and are we starting to stocktake on how that is going to happen? And then finally, I think just making submissions, just submitting numbers, the biggest win, if we want, in the Paris Agreement is also the verification element, the MRV element, the monitoring, the verification and implementation of some of these aspects. So and that is maybe already built into the process, but in the end, the parties will have to decide which submissions, which data, which elements of the Global Stocktake sort of assembly of information they're going to prioritize. And I hope that they will prioritize the information that is verified, the information that is reliable, that can be monitored, in the process, because I think that's where the many decision makers in future years, that is at least my hope, will point to the stocktake of 2023 and take decisions, make development decisions based on the global stocktake. It's not individual parties. It's an inclusive, effective process in the Paris Agreement, but it has the potential, especially if it results in a decision by the members of the Paris Agreement, it has the potential to set the tone for the next 5 years, and many development decisions, many governmental but also business and financing decisions will be based and will take guidance from the global stocktake. And I hope the parties, the UNFCCC Secretariat, I think the Secretariat is well aware how significant the global stocktake will be as a report, as guidance for the next 5 years. But you know, I'm slightly more skeptical when I look at some of the parties and how they are aiming to treat the process. So I think Petra's suggestion that we need to find legal ways of connecting the global stocktake decision or outcome with new NDCs and really use it as a bit of a yardstick of what the NDC ambition should look like for the parties would go a very, very long way. Thank you. Those 3 suggestions from my side. Thank you, Andrew.
Great. Thanks very much, Marcus. Some really interesting suggestions there that I'm sure we'll come back to in our discussions afterwards. I'd like then to move on to Jaap Speer, who's Senior Associate, Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and to share his thoughts for the morning with us. Thank you. Over to you, Jaap.
You're muted.
You need to unmute yourself.
That's it. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we all know we are swiftly heading towards global catastrophe. I have great admiration for the drafters of the Paris Agreement, but we also know that it was not the game changer we had hoped for. It contains few concrete obligations, let alone concrete obligations of single states, and even less so of enterprises. Seeing recent IPCC reports, the international community takes the view that an increase of global emissions by 1.5 C should be the upper limit. And yes, it should, but let's be realistic. It's utterly unrealistic. There are many reasons for that point. I mention just 2. First, the stance taken by the US, Russia, China, and India. And secondly, the war in Ukraine. Extremely unhelpful. According to the prevailing view, we still have about 30 years to reduce global emissions to 0. Again, it's extremely unlikely that we still have 30 years. Much more likely than not, the carbon budget will be depleted much, much earlier. I can't assess whether the global community still is talking about 1.5 C stroke 2050. Perhaps it's pragmatism. And if it's pragmatism, they may even be right. Advocating what is perceived as impossible may be counterproductive, possibly. Naturally, sufficient and enforceable international instruments would be the panacea. Such instruments may be forged in the future but we don't have time to wait for what is likely not going to happen. We need other strategies. And I realize that there is no single strategy that can solve the global problems, but at least we could contribute. Seeing the current stalemate, NGOs and alleged victims increasingly initiate litigation. They hope that judiciary will stem the tide. But judges face tremendous challenges. They have to remove many legal obstacles. They enter a highly political scene. They have to interpret a law which at best offers building blocks for solutions. Some courts have granted courageous judgments containing at times far-reaching relief. Others play the card of the political argument. This is a matter to be dealt with by politicians, or opt for one or more legal features to dismiss claims. We should be cautious to put our cards entirely on litigation. Courts have to wait for the right cases. It often takes many years before we have cases decided. Thus, I'm not saying that litigation is unimportant. It is important, but we need more than that. As a rule, and with the exception of international adjudicators, states can only be sued before their national courts. And courts in key countries, and we all know about which countries I'm talking about, are unlikely to grant meaningful relief. Knocking on the doors of international adjudicators is fraught with risk. Some will abstain, others will take a cautious stance, thus setting the bar too low, seen from what is globally required. Judgments issued by international courts or tribunals will often say, well, this is enough, whereas it's not enough. And that has ripple effects also on national law. Precisely because it is unlikely that litigation against states, however useful and important, will end up in globally sufficient and enforceable judgments, the corporate sector comes into play. Unlike states, many enterprises can be sued before multiple courts. Many enterprises and their legal advisors one-dimensionally seem to focus on the perceived outcome of litigation before their national courts. Seeing the global consequences of greenhouse gas emissions, that view is likely mistaken. Admittedly, it's not overly likely that all courts in, say, Africa, Asia, and Latin America will grant what many of us may perceive as far-reaching relief. It is, however, also very unlikely that all courts in those parts of the world will only grant modest relief. Their interests are very different compared to ours. Why should their judges care about our desire to keep our luxurious lifestyle when many of their people don't have access to clean water and or live below or just above the poverty line? It's in the laps of the gods how courts around the globe will interpret the law and what kind of relief they will grant. For just mentioned reasons, it can't be taken for granted that their interpretation will be very different around the globe. The likely prospect of far-reaching judgments issued by at least some courts around the globe should be a reason for enterprises to scale up their measures to reduce their own emissions and those of their suppliers and products. Seeing the short-term vision and interests of those at the wheel is unlikely to happen soon. Even if the penny drops, the boards would only know that they have to do more, but they don't know what precisely they have to do, how much more. Hence, a lot will be gained if it were possible to discern legal obligations of enterprises. That would enable them to comply. It would enable others to assess whether enterprises comply, and it would also allow others to take appropriate steps if enterprises fail to comply. An international group of experts has tried to map the legal core obligations of first states and secondly enterprises and investors, the principles on climate obligations of enterprises. These principles contain, among many other issues, obligations concerning the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, also of the value chain and governance. According to Principle 18, paragraph 5, the selection of a supplier of goods with its head office in a country that significantly falls short of meeting its key reduction obligation mentioned in the Oslo Principles requires justification. The commentary explains that this principle is, I quote, a bit aspirational, arguably on the fringe of revolutionary. The reason to introduce it is to make it attractive for countries to comply with their obligations, which unfortunately is bitterly needed, unquote. Well, I admit this principle is perhaps overly creative. If so, we have to think about other strategies to make free riding unattractive. The principles are based on our group's interpretation of the law as it stands or will likely develop. Our aimed audience may arrive at the conclusion that our assessment is mistaken. Fair enough, but it would be irresponsible to believe that enterprises don't have legal obligations. And it is also irresponsible to assume that courts around the globe will abstain. UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd, kindly wrote about our principles. The principles are a timely and compelling contribution that clarifies the critical role that businesses must play in addressing the global climate emergency and preventing catastrophic impacts on human rights. These principles should be understood and applied as legally binding obligations, not as voluntary guidelines. And the former UK Supreme Court Justice Lord Canberra wrote, "The principles can be taken as a fair indication as how the law stands or is likely to develop." Still, our principles did not gain much support in the corporate and financial world. It is, however, of utmost importance to draft a blueprint of obligations or responsibilities that stand a fair chance to gain widespread support from key players, i.e. the corporate sector, investors, international organizations, NGOs, and vulnerable countries. The outcome should pair ambition and pragmatism. If there is any chance to influence the global development of climate law, such a blueprint stands out. It seems a fair bet that the widely accepted blueprint will majorly contribute to the development of climate law. Ever more enterprises will comply to avoid litigations that they are doomed to lose. We are on the eve of a new wave of claims, damages, the cost of adaptation included. A German case, a Swiss case, and the recent decision of the UN Human Rights Committee, CCPR, in Billy and others versus Australia is telling. To me, it belabors the obvious that fully fledged liability must be avoided, although I realize that losses don't disappear if they are left uncompensated. It must be avoided that those who caused the mess will reap the fruits of liability, leaving those who need compensation most, i.e. vulnerable countries, citizens in those countries and future generations empty-handed. We should explore solutions that strike the fairest possible balance between the hugely diverging interests. I've been thinking and writing about that topic for 20 years, perhaps a little bit more even. There is no self-explanatory answer, I know that. But it would be very useful to provide guidance to adjudicators who not always have the time, the knowledge, and the resources to arrive at solutions that do justice to the case in point without compromising the interests of the environment and those who need compensation most. I've tried to offer a very concise roadmap of how the law could, and in my view, should develop, and how we could cope with the many challenges posed by climate change. More in my forthcoming climate litigation in a changing world. As I said, lawyers should not pretend that they can solve all problems. We can't. That's only possible if experts from many disciplines join forces. But we should contribute to the very best we can. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, that's really a fascinating roundup and really, really helpful, I think, for our ongoing discussions. So I think that concludes the formal presentations that this morning, if I'm right. So we now have opportunity for questions and sort of further discussions. Does anybody have a burning question or point they'd like to raise at this time? You can use the chat or raise your hand, and I'll do my best to spot things. I've actually got a question for Marcus, because I was really interested that you brought up sort of aviation and shipping and sort of transport in general as a kind of example of enterprises that might be able to contribute to the global stocktake. And I just wondered, can you say a bit more about which, if any, of these enterprises have already contributed and how they might contribute? I mean, I'm just asking that because I've been using the greenhouse gas emissions factors that the UK government uses for different companies to be able to display how much or how little they're sort of following, you know, kind of net zero principles and things like that. And it does seem, when you drill down into it, there are quite a few anomalies. And I just wondered, so I suppose a more general question than how has shipping or transport been contributed, is how do you actually ascertain the validity or the accuracy of the, say, any figures that you're given?
Yeah, I mean, you've put your finger on something that sort of occupies lawyers. The problem is that UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement don't directly apply to these sort of international processes. So we have adopted this week, 6 years ago, CORSIA, which is a kind of offsetting mechanism under the ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization. So it's sort of hived off, if you want, to the specialized UN bodies that deal with international shipping or international aviation. We have an IMO decision to at least report emissions from shipping. But more and more countries are worried that with an increase in international aviation and international shipping, we're losing some of the sort of hard-won gains. And so the EU is actively preparing to apply their emission trading system, the ETS, to shipping, which is for international lawyers, I'm looking at the law of the sea experts, hugely problematic, because of course, you know, the shipping emissions don't just happen in your exclusive economic zone or in your national waters, they happen all around the globe. And so an international mechanism is much better placed. There are some indicators, there are some estimates, but thus far, very few countries include those emissions that happen in international spheres, if you want, in their NDCs, and that's I think we're losing a little bit if we're not looking at those internationalized emissions. But Nilofer is probably more expert on this than I am.
Yes, Nilofer, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I do. And Marcus, I think you gave a very good response. And again, you know, two fantastic presentations. And I think I'm going to watch this session again, all the information, but I wanted to follow up a little bit on a point that Andrew raised in relation to Marcus, and what Marcus said, and also Jaap, this, you know, the role of adjudication. But Marcus, I think, you know, the international trade, that's your expertise. It is really outside this process. Yes, it's critical. So, you know, do you see the possibility that it can actually work counter to ambition? Or is there a process in place that can actually support it? And for Jaap as well, and one thing I wanted to raise in terms of, we look at the traditional courts at the both domestic and international level, but I would say the hidden bomb, these investment cases. And we had a roundtable at our office the other day, and we were talking about this case, investment treaty case, arbitration, where Italy had to pay like 9 times the original investment of a coal power plant than what the coal power plant had actually laid out for compensation. So if states, I mean, so if we want, on the one hand, states to take ambition, be ambitious, you know, phase out fossil fuels, but if we don't have those other elements, whether it be trade, the rules, the regulations, or investment treaty, which is really in the hand of this private arbitration. So your thoughts on that? And then after that, I apologize, I'm going to have to leave after I hear your responses.
And maybe I can briefly come in. Nilofer, you're absolutely right? So we're not, what is suboptimal is you're doing a lot of reductions at home and you're just exporting the emission to other parts of the world. On the other hand, international trade, as we all know, is probably the easiest way to lift a country out of poverty. So we have to strike a very careful balance between encouraging our trading partners to live up to their own NDCs, and we just concluded, and we just finished a project on that, because you can design trade agreements, trade obligations in a way that supports the partner countries' NDCs rather than undermining it. And if all countries lived up to their NDCs and actually complied with what they said to the international community they would do on climate change, I think the trading regime would also fare much better. But you're quite right, Nilofer, that trade panels, maybe increased arbitration under bilateral and regional trade agreements. I see several people in the room who are on the EU sustainable development and trade arbitrators lists. So the EU ran a process trying to identify people who are actually knowledgeable about climate change, the SDGs, and those kind of objectives, is a critical process. Investment law hasn't reached that yet. The EU tried to reform the investment law regimes by introducing an investment court system, which would have required people to demonstrate expertise in environmental law, in climate change regulations. At the moment, the arbitrators are freely chosen by the parties, and it's a very small group of arbitrators that are chosen repeatedly for the different processes. And I'm just, I don't even, I wouldn't suggest that they are sort of nefarious in their decision making. I think they just don't fully understand the connection between coal investments, coal-fired power plants, and and climate change. I was involved in the first Vattenfall case, where Germany canceled the coal-fired power plant permit. We made a submission on behalf of the city of Hamburg to the federal government of Germany. Germany declined to run the climate change argument because they didn't want to have other countries in the world run the climate change arguments against German companies, right? That's the sort of web of investment tribunals and arbitration. We were very disappointed as a federated entity, as a city, that the main reason for canceling the coal-fired power plant wasn't actually on the table in the arbitration, and eventually Germany settled, which I thought was a lost opportunity. But we need to shed much more light on the design of the rules and how they're fashioned, and then also maybe feed in some of the data of the outcome of these cases into the global stocktake and highlight that it's not okay to compensate someone for a coal-fired power plant. It's a bit like the compensation that was paid for slavery, right? So we recognize it's a morally apprehensive behavior, and we compensate you nonetheless because we want to keep you quiet. That's not okay.
Well, I'm also extremely critical about the investment treaties, and I couldn't agree more with everything that has already been said about it.
Andrew? I think he might have just, he's frozen. Yeah.
I think you need to come in, Petra.
Yeah, I was going to do that, but I feel like now I'm overstepping over moderator here. So I hope you will forgive me. I just wanted to make a few comments and also briefly mention I saw Justice Brian Preston and Linda Siegele in the audience and elevated them to panelists. So I'm absolutely delighted to have you here. Very warm welcome. And we have collaborated in the past, and you're of course very welcome to come in with any comments here. It's fantastic to see you. And I also wanted to thank Markus and Jaap for their excellent and insightful comments, and try to bring in Imogen's contribution as well and make a few comments there. But I wanted to ask wanted to start with the role of courts, and I fully agree with Jaap that we can't leave it all to national or even international courts, although they make a really important contribution, not just on the climate law issues, but sometimes even on these wider issues, for example, constitutional law. And we had on Monday, we had Justice Andreas Paulos, who was part of the German Federal Constitutional Court, when it delivered its climate case. And he made a really interesting comment. He said that in Article 20A, which is a general objective to protect the environment in the German Basic Law, we now see that the Paris Agreement has been constitutionalized in that provision. And then he also confirmed, I asked him specifically whether that was the right interpretation taken from the decision, that the German government has an obligation from the constitution to seek a resolution or a solution at the international level. So it's not just collaborate and a soft recommendation or anything, it's a constitutional obligation stemming from the state objective for the state to find a solution internationally. And I think this is, I know it's only one country, but it supports the view that this global stocktake, if it is the key oversight mechanism, must be part of this finding a solution at the international level process. It can't just be another report, another outcome. We already know what the outcome is most likely to be. I don't think we will see really a positive surprise. So I think it's really up to the state, and here in particular the one state where the Constitutional Court has confirmed it, to tighten the focus on finding a solution. And in terms of doing that in our contribution here, I think there are a few themes that are emerging, and I just wanted to take this chance to bring these together. And Imogen brought in the performance indicators, or the how we measure progress aspects or elements. And I think that would be really interesting if perhaps we could come up even with a submission that clearly states the need for recommendations to come out of this process as part of the outcomes, but then also performance indicators that tell us how have these recommendations been taken on board across a timeline, perhaps not just a 5-year cycle, but really sooner. How can we establish that a state has taken this on board and has use this in the planning process for the NDCs, because it's not just the outcome of the NDC that should be informed, it's the planning process, and that should be an ongoing permanent process. So it would be really interesting to see how we could take these ideas forward, and then also going forward thinking about what we can discuss for the conferences. I think it would be interesting to see how, at least in their periphery, these different concepts of the Paris Agreement overlap. So we haven't really touched upon the compliance committee, for example, today, but it could, of course, pick up systemic issues that it finds that parties or a number of parties are not taking on board the outcomes of the global stocktake. Would that be something that the compliance committee could look at, for example? And also, if the compliance committee is not satisfied about the participation of one party in the multilateral facilitation of progress process, so this more governmental-led diplomatic process, so to speak, for oversight, in addition to the global stocktake, this different mechanism, which already existed under the Kyoto Protocol in a slightly different shape. If the committee finds that a state is not participating in that process, it could also bring this up to the attention and work with that party to see how this could be facilitated. So I think it would be interesting to see how these different concepts and aspects of the Paris Agreement can be brought together to make sure that we see a meaningful outcome of the global stocktake, not just as a plan B, but in addition to making it hopefully a legally meaningful process.
May I, Chairman?
Please, yeah, sorry, I cut out and then I'm back in again.
With due respect, the message from the German justice seems a little bit a message from the ivory tower. Well, ideally, of course, it would be fantastic if it would be possible to find international solutions. But we know only too well that there are many countries, many important and influential countries included, who will never ever be willing to enact an international instrument that really solves the problem. So Well, of course, we should try, clearly, but we should also accept that that is very, very unlikely going to happen, and that we need to think about alternative solutions.
Great. Does anybody have any feedback for Jaap on that? Petra.
I really can't speak for Justice Andreas Paulus, but I think when you read the judgment, what they do say is that there is first and foremost an international obligation or an obligation for the state to seek in the international negotiations a solution to the problem that doesn't absolve the state to be ambitious on the ground. And this is, I think, the key information from the judgment, or the key message. And there have been changes to the targets, as we know. But it is nevertheless, I think, a step forward into the right direction, because we didn't have this clearly articulated before. We always knew there's an obligation to cooperate under the Constitution, but this clear mandate, so to speak, that is now part of the objective of the state under Article 20A of the Basic Law, that is novel. And I think that gives an additional onus and additional emphasis on the state now going to these COP negotiations and really doing its best, and also reporting back to Parliament that this is what they have done, and that, you know, it's that they have fulfilled this constitutional obligation. I completely see the limitations, and that this is just one state, but nevertheless, it's a state that is responsible for 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions with 1% of the world's population. So it is a contribution to be made there. Thank you.
Marcus.
Yeah, I had the pleasure yesterday to chair a panel on climate litigation around the world at the Oslo IUCN World Commission conference. And I was struck by how many countries in the global south are also starting to see climate litigation cases coming forward. Very interesting is a case in the Mexican courts, where Greenpeace and other NGOs challenged the very low ambition NDC by the government, saying you're actually violating your own constitutional obligations by submitting a lukewarm NDC to the international processes, right? So that's, I think, quite interesting that the courts, at the moment just the district court, but might go to the Supreme Court, agreed with the applicants, saying you have an obligation under the Mexican Constitution and the right to a healthy environment to actually up your ambition and to be ambitious also in your communications with the international community.
Thank you. Do we have any further contributions, points people want to raise for discussion? No. Otherwise, I think we should draw things to a close now. We've had a couple of speakers who weren't able to attend, so it's actually a shorter program than was originally envisaged. So, Petra, would you like to finish with your closing remarks, please?
Yeah, thank you again so much, and thank you to everyone who has participated in this workshop. And I know not everyone is here who participated on Tuesday, but because this is recorded, I would like to thank everyone who has participated throughout this week. It's been really intense. It's also been very intense in terms of preparations, and I know not everybody is here and can attend, who has worked really hard behind the scenes to make sure we do get the Zoom links and everything is set up. So I really want to thank as well Gary and Ryla and Matthias and Jess on our side. I think it's fabulous to have. Without their support, we couldn't do all of this. And I would also like to thank all our speakers, and some of them came in really last minute, some others couldn't make it for medical emergencies. thank you so much for the contributions, and we will take all of this on board. I think there's been so much information throughout this week, and refine our concept note and share it with everyone. And as you know, this is not just a workshop occasion. We really want to continue the discussion, and also in the light of what Walter said, that this is useful for the Secretariat, and convene the conferences next year. And we will refine the concept note, share it with all of you, and hopefully then have a real live meeting in person in Durham on the 30th and 31st of March. So keep that date, please, already in the diaries. And then later on in Singapore as well. This date has still to be confirmed. Thank you again very much for expertly sharing as well, Andrew. And now over to you for very final words. And thank you again very much.
Well, thank you, Petra, and thanks everybody. As I said at the beginning, I'm a novice to this field, and I've learned an awful lot today. And also, as a moderator, I'd like to thank you all for keeping to time. I've not had to use the Tibetan singing bowl once, so I might as well finish this this particular workshop with the ringing tones of the Tibetan singing bowl. And thank you, everybody, and we look forward to meeting you in Durham in March, if not before. Thank you.